The next and last step we will discuss is design the architecture. Now, there is a lot to talk about in this subject, but I want to focus on the most important things here, since this course is about microservices architecture and not a specific component architecture. If you want to explore more the components architecture topic, you can check out my other course, The Complete Guide to Becoming a Software Architect, which covers this and other architectural topics quite extensively. So, what do we have to say about the architecture of a service in a microservices architecture? Well, first, that it does not differ from regular software's architecture. The ideas are the same, the patterns and practices are the same. In fact, from the components architecture point of view, they are completely the same. But still, it's always good to get a reminder on that, and in case you're not familiar with software architecture patterns, then this is a great opportunity to learn it. Our discussion here will be around the layers paradigm, which is the leading paradigm in software architecture. So, let's talk about layers. Layers in software architecture represent horizontal functionality of a software component. Let's see what it means. When we think about traditional software, we usually think about three kinds of tasks the software needs to do. First, it should expose something to the outer world. This something can be user interface or API or, of course, both. Next, it should execute logic of some sort. This logic might involve some calculation, validation, processing, accessing external systems. Whatever it is, there is some logic involved. The next task has usually something to do with a data store. We usually need to save or retrieve data from the store, and this is the third task our software needs to accomplish. Now, when talking about layers, we map a layer to each one of these tasks. And so, we have the user interface or service interface layer, called often UI or SI, the business logic layer or BL, responsible for executing the service's logic, and the data access layer or DAL, responsible for handling all aspects of data access, such as connection handling, querying and saving data, and transaction handling. The BL layer will usually handle validation, enrichment, and computations. And the UI and SI layer will expose API, handle JSON parameters, and sometimes perform authentication. So these are the classic layers we usually have in a software component. Now, all that is nice and good, but what is the purpose of all this? Why do we need layers in our software? Won't it be simpler if the UI will simply access the database instead of going through the BL every time? Well, good question, and the answer is twofold. There are two main reasons for going with layers. The first, it forces the design of a well-formed and focused code. When we know we now work on the logic and just logic, our codebase will be more focused and will not start dealing with other tasks, such as opening communication channel or saving to the database. And the focused code is easier to maintain. Another reason is that layers make our code modular. If, for example, our data access layer works with Oracle, and now we want to make our service work with MySQL, we will just need to replace this layer, and the other layers, the UI and BL, won't be affected by this change. In fact, if done correctly, these layers will probably not even know the database has changed, and that's because layers can make the code so much modular. Now, I want to mention one of the most important concepts of layers, which is code flow. Let's take a look at a typical component with the classic layers, UI, BL, and DAL. Now, the UI can access the BL layer, which is immediately underneath it, but in no way can it skip the BL layer and talk directly to the data access layer. This will break the modularity of the code and create strong coupling between these two layers. In addition, a layer must not access the layer above it. So, for example, the data access layer must not access the business logic layer. Doing that will again break the natural code flow and make the system less modular. Okay, so that was the service architecture, and that concludes our discussion about the architecture process. I hope you've learned a lot, and I hope you feel you now possess the knowledge you need to begin designing microservices architecture. Again, if you have any question, do not hesitate to contact me. I promise to read everything I receive, and I will respond in a timely manner. And now, let's move on to the next section.